one of the reasons why I put a great deal of faith in the dignity of humanity in every other person, being conscientious and stoic, is because I do believe and hold faithful to the tenet that all people count and that we should dignify every human being, regardless of their standing in community. You can be rich, you can be poor, you can be a doctor, lawyer, an interviewer, whatever. It is incumbent upon us as human beings to treat the other person as a human being.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Dr. Carolyn Calloway-Thomas, a professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University. She is an intercultural communication competence advisory expert on the World Council for Intercultural and Global Competence. She's also the past president of the World Communication Association. She is also the author of Empathy in the Global World, an Intercultural Perspective, an incredible book about empathy. And I want to welcome her so much to this show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Just for the viewers and listeners to know, I was girl crushing on you before I pressed record, and I shared with you some pages, how much of the book has been underlined. You know, I've read dozens and dozens and dozens of empathy books. I can still never get enough of it. And this is one of my favorites. So this means a lot to me to have this conversation, and I'm sure we're going to have a great chat. Before I do an interview with a guest, I'll invite the guest to actually share what he or she or they want as main takeaways. And I want to reflect back for the audience to hear, because the language of what you shared is so beautiful. And just for you to hear it back as a way of beginning our conversation. So you write, every time we have a moment to uplift humanity, we should do so, passing along stories that ignite and have an extraordinary impact on people in edifying ways. For empathy to become realized in more exquisite ways, we must not only know about the challenging conditions that confront us, such as climate change or poverty, war, violence, and hatred, but we must also recognize the humanity in every person. This is the way of empathy in the global age. Spoken like a true Jedi. How does that feel when you hear those words back? What comes to you?
They make me feel really good and motivated and inspired to know that my words have meant something to you. And I hope that they have meant something to the people who are listening out there in the global world. So I feel comforted knowing that we are kindred spirits. I feel comforted knowing that there are people who are dedicated to the proposition that we ought to, as much as we possibly can, eliminate messiness in the world so that all people can flourish and do marvelous things. I believe that we are designed to do something marvelous in the world, and that we did not come into the world just to sit around and do things that are not for the common good. So hearing those words really do remind me of where I came from, my roots. I'm an agrarian woman. I grew up in a very, very small town in Bernice, Louisiana, 14 miles from South Arkansas, where community was valued. And I think that the notion of coming from a small community where people mattered, that has really been with me all the days of my life. And so I take human beings very seriously. And my husband sometimes teases me because he says, Carolyn never meets a stranger. And it's the case. Wherever I am, I'm trying to strike up a conversation with people because I learn a great deal simply by having a conversation with people. But more than that, I think having a conversation with people says something about our humanity. It says that I take you very seriously, and I hope that you're taking me very seriously, that we are in this world for a brief moment, 100 years from my perspective, very short moment. So I usually say, what can I do to glorify humanity? And what can I do to make somebody else's life a bit more comforting? I always try to be kind to people. Kindness is a value that means a great deal to me. So thank you for those words.
Your words like edifying and exquisite. I mean, kind of goosebumpy words. And why not, right? We can
Yes,
feed the wolf that is of hatred or feed the wolf that is of
yes,
exquisite and
yes,
edifying. And why
yes.
wouldn't we
Mhm,
choose that?
mhm,
So I wonder, Carolyn, if you could explain why you've spent years of your career studying empathy, if
mhm,
there's something about empathy from an intellectual standpoint that excites you, but also maybe from a lived experience, if there's anything that
mhm,
has
mhm.
brought you to see empathy as such an important pursuit.
Well, in my book, I do tell the story of what happened to me when I was a young girl growing up in Bernice, Louisiana. And on that particular day, my father and I went downtown. We were on the main streets of Bernice, Louisiana. And at the time, there was one traffic light in Bernice, Louisiana. That tells you how small the place was and still is. I think we have three at the moment. But I was walking with my father and we passed by a drugstore. And I said to my father, I'd love to go into the drugstore and get an ice cream cone. And I watched my father in a dejected manner when he said, I am sorry, but we cannot go into that store because dot, dot, dot. That moment had a powerful impact upon my life. And suddenly I saw that people can be mean to other human beings. And I think from that very moment and other moments that I could detail, I made certain that I was kind to people and that I was not shoddy in other people's presence. And as best I could, that I would not accept shoddiness from other people. So that was a pivotal moment in my life. And I think also because I grew up in the Baptist church and I took very seriously that we should love one another, that we should be generous to one another. So those are some reasons why my early experiences morphed into an intellectual moment. And so later on, when I grappled with the issue of why are people mean to other people, I began to think, well, perhaps we could find another way, and that way might be the way of empathy. And at that moment, I began to study empathy. And then I asked the question, well, how did other people long ago, far away, how did they deal with empathy? Because we know it was not until the 18th century that people began to classify people in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their gender. Prior to that time, in the hunter-gathering time, we didn't think in those ways. So I wondered at what moment did empathy come into the world. And so then I began to ask the question, under what conditions does empathy succeed and under what conditions does it fail? And for that reason, in my book, I talk about immigration, I talk about media, and I talk about other things that give us some sensibility of why empathy matters and how we can make it take root and fly in the world.
Just want to take a breath to take all of that in, because I think that there are examples of lived experience when people have experienced separation or marginalization or disenfranchisement like you have. And it's easy to gloss over that. But I'm listening to you tell the story. I'm sure that's obviously not the first time you've told a story. You've written about it. I'm sure you've shared it elsewhere. That people all over the world right now are experiencing that kind of marginalization in different forms. And I wonder, you know, I don't know if you unpacked it with your dad. I don't know how you integrated that, but what would you tell your younger self that could be helpful? That anybody who's listening who has felt that kind of pain, you know, I understand that part of it was because of your faith, but you are also you are also psychology, right? You have a psychological landscape, and that must have hurt. And you could have been angry about it. So I don't know. I wonder if you could just.
I was disappointed and I was hurt because I love ice cream.
Yeah.
But more specifically, it touched and tore at a fabric of my soul the idea that I am a human being and that I was not treated like a human being. And one of the reasons why I put a great deal of faith in the dignity of humanity in every other person, you know, being Kantian and Stoic, is because I do believe and hold faithful to the tenet that all people count and that we should dignify every human being, regardless of their standing in community. You can be rich, you can be poor, you can be a doctor, lawyer, an interviewer, whatever. It is incumbent upon us as human beings to treat the other person as a human being, being human being, to use Dr. Malefia Santi's language. I love that language, that we must be human beings, being human beings. And so that really makes a great deal of difference from my perspective. It raises a question, what does it mean to be a human being? And it raises a question of what are we supposed to do while we're on this earth? And it raises a question of relational issues. And it raises a question of how we can live in a moment where people denigrate other people, how we can live in a moment where people demonize other people simply because they disagree. Now, if there's anything that this book could do and that we could do, Anita, it would be to get to the point where we could say to individuals, you can differ in terms of your ideas, in terms of your values, in terms of your attitudes, but we are under obligation to say to the other person, may I hear your voice? What do you have to say about it? And then bring the ideas together based upon argument and based upon a sensibility to the other person's perspective. I think if we could do that, we would eliminate a lot of the demonization that is going on in the United States. I don't know about you, Anita, but I'm sure you are mindful of how people talk about each other. And I grew up at a moment where you were not supposed to do that. And I was a debater in college. And the one thing that our debate coach told us was that you go to the idea. You do not use invectives. And I hold fast to that principle. So I think empathy matters primarily because, I mean, there are other reasons, but one reason is because it teaches us about the dignity of humanity of every other human being, and that every person is worth something. And it is in that our dignity inheres. The very fact that we are human being means that we ought to be taken seriously. And I'm appalled, quite honestly, by some comments that I hear when people seem to suggest that because one is rural, because one is agrarian, because one does not have money, that those individuals don't count. And there I am holding aloft the flame that says, no, you don't want to go down that road.
Absolutely. You know, you make me think of something I learned and that I wrote about, and that also features in your book. So I see that your book is on your shelf. I'm really happy to see that. Yours has a circle formation. Mine has a circle formation. I learned this from a woman who works with museum curators who hopes to create spaces for the public to elevate their capacity to empathize. Her name is Elif Gökçeadem, and she is originally from Turkey. She studied Islamic art for her PhD, and she taught me about the circle as a metaphor for empathy. And she talks about how as a geometric shape, the circle is made up of an infinite number of dots along the circumference. And if you add 10 dots, 10,000, 10 million, the shape stays the same, it just grows in size. And she invited me to think about the 8 billion people that are on the planet, each taking up one of the spaces, one of the dots along the circumference of the circle. And she described how the circle is a great metaphor for empathy, because if you look at the center as what gives us breath, you could call it Buddha, you could call it whatever God, life-giving force you want, all of us, without exception, along the circumference are equidistant to source, equidistant to that center, which is what you're saying, right? Everybody matters. Everybody deserves love and peace and dignity. And whether we're side by side or nearby or on opposite sides of the circle, even though we're equidistant to the center, we all have a different perspective to the center. And I just found that such a powerful metaphor.
That is beautiful. That is beautiful, because it also says, and when you mentioned the 8 billion people, empathy tells us that because there are 8 billion people on this planet, and because we cannot interact with every single person on the planet, and because we cannot have a relationship specifically in person with every person, those 8 billion people, one of the things that we can do, and I talk about this in the book, we can have a sufficient effort of imagination, and we can learn what it is like to live by someone else's light without having to encounter that person. And so the imagination is a powerful thing. And if we doubt its power, we can think of narratives. You know, our best stories. And I think of Celie in Color Purple, where Celie says, "It seems like only a fool would talk in a way that is peculiar to your mind." And when I read that, I thought, that is really a heady idea. And it focused my attention on the idea that even though I was not Celie in that book, I could identify with Celie in Color Purple. And so I think that's what empathy does. Empathy says, even though you cannot be me directly and I cannot be you directly, I can, with that imagination, see what your life is like and pit it against what my life is like. And that makes all the difference in the world. And I think it keeps demonization at bay. If we do that, if we think of the dignity of people, then we're not as readily, keenly interested in and saying nasty, ugly, messy things about people. Rather, we can go the beautiful way and say something kind and generous. And I think of Nelson Mandela, who was one of my heroes, and I think of his inaugural address in 1994 and how he took a moment where he could have been so mean and so nasty and so hurtful to the white South Africans. But Nelson Mandela, in his inaugural address, decided that he would talk about the soil, that he would talk about the jacaranda trees in Pretoria. And I feel moved every time I say this. The jacaranda trees in Pretoria and the mimosa trees in the Bushveld. And he was trying to get South Africans, like South Africans, white South Africans, to understand that there was that soil, the soil metaphor, and the rootedness of the people that they shared in common. And so that very moment, he said, even though I was imprisoned for 27 years, I'm willing to allow empathy to parade around the grounds and to tell people in a roaming way what it is possible for human beings to do and be. And so that's one of the reasons I love him, because he centered the dignity of humanity of every other person. And you cannot improve upon Nelson Mandela unless, of course, you think of Martin Luther King Jr. And other, Marisa Teresa, Mother Teresa, and other individuals.
Yeah, the luminaries that were edifying us and uplifting us. Yes. I'm like moved. I want to go back to school so I can take your class just to be around you.
Mhm.
I'm sure people listening and watching are feeling the same way, which is
Yeah,
why I so love doing these interviews.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so I want to read a couple of quotes that I took from
Okay.
your book
Mhm.
again
Okay.
as a preamble before asking the next question. So you write, the challenge of empathy is the great challenge of our time.
Mhm.
Boom, mic drop, right?
Mhm.
And then you also write, if we do not follow the way of empathy, then what and who will save us? And
Yes, yes.
finally, talking about the goal of the book, right? My
Mhm.
goal is
Mhm.
to understand the nature and zones of empathy and under what conditions
Mhm.
empathetic practices
Mhm.
succeed and under what conditions they fail. You've obviously done great research, and that's
Mhm.
what the book
Mhm.
describes. But you also say, furthermore, my purpose is to understand how empathy can be cultivated in order for humans to reach their full potential. And
Mhm.
I find
Mhm.
in the whole conversation
Mhm.
around empathy that that sometimes often gets missed, that it's
Mhm.
always sort of external bound. We want to, I believe it's critical that we learn how to stop othering each other and find the common humanity.
Mhm. Mhm.
But what I think is also very hopeful and very exciting is that that process also allows us to become better versions of ourselves, right?
Mhm.
So I find that beautiful.
Mhm.
So how does empathy contribute
Mhm.
to the public good, and how does it contribute to human flourishing?
Well, I like the way you put that in terms of a better version of ourselves, because a man that I stumbled upon his work, Frederick Hayek, who's a renowned economist, a Nobel Prize winner. And in one of his works, he says the following, and I'm going to use a word that people don't use today, but I want to quote him. He says that civilization rests on the idea that we all benefit from knowledge we do not possess. We
Mm.
all benefit from knowledge we do not possess. That really hoisted me up by my lapel, and I thought, look at that. This is why empathy matters. Empathy allows us to have congenial cultural ecosystems so that we are free to innovate, to create, to bring forth beautiful literature, to do all the marvelous things that we do in the world. And if we find ourselves casting ourselves in the role of enemy, then we do not have an opportunity for that human flourishing to occur. And I think of the African American women who helped the space industry, and they're immortalized in the movie Hidden Figures. And I think, wow, look at that. Look at what those women were able to do because they had the time and the energy to think and to create. And so if we take away that moment, then we're really taking away the possibility of the world to continue and for populations to continue and for the human race to continue, because if we don't find answers to the challenges and threats that confront us in moments of stability and serenity, then human flourishing will disappear from the face of the earth. And that's why I usually say to my students when I teach my Transforming Divided Communities class, I say, we don't want to go down that road. We don't want to be in a positionality where we are bickering all the time and where we don't have a moment to think and reflect and come up with some spectacular inventions. And I could name them, and you know all of them in terms of technology and the airplane, medicines. I mean, we could just roam around the globe and point out things that have occurred because we were not at each other's throats.
Yeah.
And when you get at each other's throats, you prevent the possibility of cultural ecstasy and loveliness.
Yeah, I was just thinking that peace is a prerequisite to ascension, the way
Yes.
you describe that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
In peace, we have the opportunity to reflect and be creative and to ascend our consciousness.
Absolutely. And think of places where you've been and where I have been,
Mm,
where people spent an entire day searching for water.
mhm,
I've seen people queue up for water for
mhm,
4 hours
mhm,
in line. And I've often thought, look at the creativity that is not being mined, it's being lost
mhm,
because people do not have an opportunity to think and to reflect. We could also go to Renaissance. And one of the reasons why Michelangelo succeeded is because he had patrons
mhm,
who gave him money and he could do the Sistine Chapel and other things. I mean, when I saw David, I thought, look at that. And then I thought, that man, Michelangelo, he had an opportunity to think and
mhm,
reflect. And
mhm,
so many people in the world do not have that opportunity. So we, in moments of empathy, we have an opportunity to make sure that those individuals, wherever they are, a Guatemalan mother, a mother in the United States, we make sure that we can think about them and help them to order their lives so that they will have moments where they can just sit a spell, as we say down south, and just think for a moment or two.
Yeah, I think the act of daydreaming is also a great privilege that comes with huge responsibility. So I take seriously Maslow's latest work just before he died. We
Mhm,
are familiar with his, triangle, the Maslow's
mhm,
hierarchy of
mhm,
needs. That at the time, it was believed that self-actualization, right? The idea of fulfilling our human potential was the highest
mhm,
place we could
mhm,
achieve in our lives. And then later in life, he wrote about self-transcendence, the idea that no, it's not about becoming everything that you can be. That's on the way to then being of service to something greater than
mhm,
yourself.
mhm, mhm,
I think that's what you're talking about, that we
mhm,
have the capacity for that and a moral responsibility to
mhm,
that.
mhm,
I
mhm,
think
mhm.
people who have the luxury of time and resources would benefit from thinking about the ways that they could be of service to others.
And I always think of the individual. I don't know how this happened, but I think about it a great deal. The individual who said at one moment, we don't have to sit on the ground on a bare rug. I can make a bench,
Mm,
however rough hewn, and I
mm,
can get us off that rug and put us on a bench. And I love that thought, and I should do some research on that. You know, who walked or talked this idea of sitting on a bench, something that seems quotidian and everyday and basic, but yet so essential to human progress.
yeah.
The idea that you don't have to sit on the ground and that you can uplift yourself. And then in the process of uplifting oneself, the creator uplifts other people. And so you don't have to worry about brambles and bushes and thorns in your body. You can think a bit more peacefully about what you want to do on a particular day. And going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't have to be at that basic level of that pyramid, but you can find yourself inching or moving however quickly up the pyramid until you get to the moment of whatever, wherever you want it to take you.
Yeah, and I think now when we get off the phone, I'm going to put the book next to my bedside table
Mhm,
because I don't know, are you like that where you read 7 or 8 books at the same time and
mhm.
one calls to you and you order some more books that you might never get to, but you
I
just,
know I'm that way.
yeah. So I've read the first few chapters of a book called Rest is Resistance.
Mhm.
And the woman is the founder of the Ministry of Rest. And it's essentially the thesis is that white supremacy and capitalism has us sort of, hustling through life and we need to rest. We
Yes.
need to rest. And one
Mhm.
chapter is devoted, I haven't got there yet, is devoted to daydreaming. And
Okay.
I think I'm going to pull that book out now after this
Uh-huh.
conversation
Yeah.
to
I
get
think I've heard of it, and it's on my list of things to read, but I'm like you. I have 5 or 6 or 8 books going at the same time, and depending on my mood, that's what I read on a particular day. But she is absolutely on spot. We do need moments so we can just sit and rest
Mhm.
and think and I'm a gardener, and I'd like to go home some days and just sit on the porch and watch the bees and the butterflies fluttering around my flowers. And I get joy out of that. And we don't talk enough about joy. I think joy is so important to human beings. And to have a joyful, joyous spirit is a good thing. And I love to meet people who are positive and reaffirming. And I think it was Montague, someone who said, when the mind considers the future with congenial expectation, it produces optimism. And don't we want all people to be optimistic and to have a congenial presence? Because congeniality is seductive. It brings something to the other human being that's bountiful and engaging and significant to human achievement.
You are that. I love your aura. You are that.
Thank you.
And with your permission, I'm going to talk about the polarity opposite. Okay, so we are attracted to people who are luminous, and we are also attracted to people who press the button of fear. So I want to talk about American politics, if you'll indulge me, which is really going another direction now. Today in the US, I mean, we're watching from Canada and we're like, oh my gosh, and now Europe has just gone further right as well. It appears to be divided into real tribal us versus them camps. So what, in your opinion, explains these divisions, and how can empathy reconcile the divisions?
Well, we're up against a primordial thing. And I have been given the honor of giving a major address at my National Communication Association coming up, and I'm going to talk about these things. But Robert Sapolsky, in his lovely book, talks about us versus them. And he talks about the role of the amygdala, the role of the brain, and that the brain really does order us in such a way that we have a bifurcation. We have us versus them. And he also says in the book that sometimes when we talk about empathy, we're talking about being empathetic toward those individuals who agree with us, as opposed to being empathetic towards individuals who do not agree with us. And that's where, for me, the role of language and argument and empathy play a commanding presence. And that is, since we know that the amygdala and the insular part of the brain deal with fear and deal with anger and deal with threats, that means that we need to work even harder to erase the divisions that exist in the United States today. And I am concerned when I see that Democrats talk about Republicans in nasty ways. Republicans sometimes talk about Democrats in nasty ways. And I'm thinking, are you not saying the same thing? Why not be able to talk about issues without using invectives? And it raises the question, can we do that? Are we hardwired such that we need to needle that person? We need to demonize people. I don't go that way. I go with you. I go with the whole notion that in our brains, we also have those endorphins that tell us we can think of loveliness and we can think of kindness and we can think of spirited things. And so that's the big struggle, though. It's a real struggle. And that is the way that the brain is wired to bifurcate us, put us into us versus them camp. And for me, that's the reason why we need to work harder, because we're working against a hunter-gatherer kind of brain that was necessary at that moment when we had all kinds of evil things lurking about in the wilderness, lions, tigers, all kinds of animals with pounce upon you. And so the brain was able to say, here comes a tiger, be ready. But now we don't have tigers. We are tamed individuals. And so given that, I would say to all Americans and to people worldwide, disagree with people. That's okay. But I don't think it's necessary for us to cast the other person in a negative role. Otherwise, persuasion as we know it is called into question. What can we do with words? What can words do? Where can they take us? And I take the position that words do matter and that they can move us toward the good. and that they can move us toward the bad, but it is the good that I am centered on. And so we have to think of the public good, the things that we share in common that we're not thinking about enough. But at the same time, I must say that there is a clash of values and beliefs and attitudes about how to solve some of the myriad of problems that exist in the United States. So I do understand that, and that people are saying, my way is the way, as opposed to saying my way is a way of answering these myriad of challenges and threats that confront us. So we must ask the question, how can we and must we reconcile our differences so that the United States will not fall apart and so that the United States will continue to flourish? And by extension, we will continue to flourish and have spectacular human existences.
And you mentioned earlier a course that you teach. I'd love for you to share a little bit what happens in that classroom, some of the lessons, some of the takeaways that students have, your approach to it. And I will layer onto that. You've spoken specifically about the American political context right now, but around the world, it's not so much that people hate each other, it's that people are killing each other. Which is along the continuum of othering, just gets worse and worse and worse, and that's the trajectory we seem to be on. How can we think about what's going on in the Middle East, for example, in relation to some of the themes that you cover in your class?
Well, one of the things that, and I put it in my syllabus, I say, I believe in cognitive diversity. I have rules. I believe in cognitive diversity, one. Number two, I believe that everybody has a right to speak his or her mind. And three, I believe that people must do it in a congenial fashion. Having said that, however, it is challenging sometimes to move the needle, so to speak, and to get people to understand that you can make an argument and you can see somebody else's positionality, but you don't have to agree with it. And so that's one of the things that I try to get my students to understand. And so when we're about to engage in a really terrifically charged debate, I would say, now remember, we can think about answers to questions. You don't have to agree with them, but you can use your mind to think of arguments for or against a particular idea or issue. And I'm happy to say that this semester, I really felt great about getting to the point where my students are able to say, yes, I understand that argument, even though I do not agree with it. And one of the things that I did, and I know you're familiar with this, Anita, is the whole notion of having students take a stance, listen, and then have another student repeat back what you think that other person has said. That was transformative. My students loved that assignment. And they were able to say, whoa, I had never listened in that way before. So listening is a variable that we don't often push or promote. And so I think that's one thing that has come from my class, Transforming Divided Communities, because I'm thinking we're talking about transforming divided communities. And so you must open your mind such that you can implement the very thing that we're talking about. And we read John Rawls' book, and people are mesmerized by that book because he does give us a sensibility about what happens when we act as if there's a veil of ignorance. We don't know who is rich. We don't know who is poor. How would you treat that other person? So that goes over in a big way. And of course, I do teach a section on empathy and community building, and that has some sway. And time permitting, I do push the idea that we need to recategorize, and that if we recategorize, then we push stereotypes at bay. And one of the examples that I give in a piece that's coming out that I theorize about the role of attention, one of the things that I say in that piece is think of how complex and various people are. And I use myself as an example. And I say, I'm a professor, I am a wife, I am an aunt, I am a gardener. I love B.B. King. I love the blues. I love reading about a range of things, science, history, intercultural books, novels. I mean, I love all of those things. Then I raise the question, who am I? Who am I? And what are you going to privilege? Of all those assortments that make up who I am, where are you going? And so I like to go to the human stance as much as I possibly can. I like to say, look at people as humans first, if that's possible. And you'll be amazed at what will happen if you just say, I have a human being in front of me. I'm going to treat that person with compassion, with respect, and with reverence until and unless I have information to the contrary. But for me, that's the first big commandment. Assume goodwill and give people the benefit of the perceptual doubt.
You have no idea how much I love listening to you talk.
Mm-hmm.
Look, it's amazing. It's amazing. I have a young woman who works and does the time stamping, and I often send her messages saying, you're going to love this one. She's going to get that message today when she's reviewing this talk. We have only a few minutes left. I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to the purposeful empathy story, which is how I always end the podcast. But I do want to, because since you've already talked about some practices, I want to share that the last chapter of this incredible book is it covers a common empathetic agenda, and you make the case for empathetic literacy, and you talk about some specific practices that we can do daily to promote empathy in a global world. So could you share a few additional practices just to get people excited to go on to their store to buy a copy?
Yeah. One of the things that I share in the book is that we assume goodwill. I think goodwill is directional. Goodwill gives us a sense of how much faith we ought to put in a person and his or her ideas. And so one of the things that happened to me that I detail in the book, and I shall never forget it because it was just amazing. I was in Riga, Latvia a few years ago. I think it was in 2006. And one of the things that I typically do when I travel is I bring back 33 gifts for members of my family. They're just tokens, right? I don't want you to think I'm bringing about big gifts, but small things that I can bring back. And so on this particular day, my colleague and I were on the streets of lovely Riga, Latvia. We're going to pick up all the gifts that I needed to pick up. And we happened upon two young girls who should have been in high school, but they were on the streets of Riga, Latvia. And one of the students says to us, why your skin black? And in a nanosecond, I said, our skin is black because we have more melanin in our skin than you. But I said, if you stay out in the sun long enough, you'll get as black as we are. Well, I was happy that I was able to say that because I assumed goodwill. I assumed that the young girl was curious. I assumed that she probably had not happened upon an African-American woman before. I assumed that I didn't want that moment to turn into something ugly and twisted. So unconsciously, I just said, and I put it in neutral, because our skin has more melanin in it. And on our way back, that same young girl said, we're out in the sun trying to get black like you. And I thought, look at that. And for me, that this very moment is one of my proudest moments that I had enough sensibility to say to that young girl, here is why. I made it fact-based, and I did not attack her. I did not demonize her. I just answered the question in a way that I thought was edifying and uplifting for her. And I am thinking that at this very moment, somewhere she's telling the story of transformation, I hope, for her. But it's significant to note that she did not ask why her skin was black or white. Rather, she said, you are the other. You are the other. But I did not say to her, how dare you say that? Who do you think you are? I mean, I could have gone off on her, but I took the main traveled road, the road to empathy, and decided that I would end it with goodwill. So for me, goodwill is really an extraordinary thing that people can do. When we are talking to people, we have to ask the question, where will my answer, where will my interactions take people? And if you assume goodwill, you're really saying to that human being, I am setting the agenda for you to know how to be a human being human being. But if you say negative things, the inclination is for people to be negative. And I just think that a lot of things happen to us that we do not will. And why should we put upon human consciousness an agenda of ugliness and wreak havoc with somebody's life? I can't do that. I cannot do that. So I try my best to do that. And I follow faithfully that tenet. Assume goodwill, give people the benefit of the perceptual doubt. A second thing that I push is the idea of making a distinction between things that happen to us because of our gender, our race, our ethnicity, or whatever, and things that happen to us in spite of it. And for me, that's one of the most lovely principles that I practice is that I always try to say, is this person saying something to me because I'm Carolyn, an African American woman, or is that person saying or behaving toward me in spite of it? And that takes a long, long, long way to getting to empathy. And I usually tell the story of something that happened to me, and I render it differently in the book, but I'll make it real today because it actually happened a few years ago. Some of my colleagues, all African Americans, and I were in the Palmer House in Chicago. And I think those of you who've been there, you know how lovely it is. And we were listening to a little night music that a gentleman was playing on the piano. And one of my friends, an African American man who at the time was associate vice provost at University of Pittsburgh, but he sat down to an elegantly scrubbed woman, sat next to her. As soon as he sat down, she popped up. And so the question is, why did she get up? And I always give that example to my students or make up some other ones based off that one and ask, why did she get up? And that exercise is compelling because it makes students understand that there could have been an infinite number of reasons why she got up. She was an artist, she was a writer, she got a brilliant idea and she had to flee. She remembered that she had locked her key in her car. I mean, all kinds of possibilities. But as soon as we say it was because he was African American, we're going down a different road altogether. And that might very well have been the reason, but we don't know. And because we don't know, then we give people the benefit of the doubt. And then we ask, did something happen because of who we are or in spite of who we are? So that's a second one that I like. And of course, the final one is to develop empathy. I'm always pushing empathy. And I've talked about ways to do that.
I've never said this to a guest, but I'm going to say it, and I mean it with such sincerity. I think what I have loved about our conversation is that it feels a little bit, and I mean this in all the best senses of the word, like a sermon. You are teacher. You are a teacher. You are a teacher on so many levels. Oh my gosh. Why have I waited so long to have this conversation? But anyways, I'm so grateful. Last question, Carolyn, before we say goodbye, which I don't want to do, but we have to do. I always end the conversation by asking my guests to consider a moment when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you. If you could think of an occasion when someone
On the receiving end of empathy. Well, I will say that the first time that I went to China, I received collective empathy, unspoken empathy, because I went to Hainan Island across from Vietnam. And when I arrived in China, there was no one in Hainan Island that I saw who looked like myself. I looked around and I saw no one. I was there for 2 weeks. The first week and a half, I saw no one who was African American or Black or African. As far as I knew, I was the only person who was African or Black. And yet I did not feel like a stranger. And I always say that somehow or the other, the people there sent messages of goodwill to me. They were not mean to me. They didn't stare at me, and they didn't say, you are the other. They were just kind people. And I think that at that moment, I was on the side of empathy, and that they were giving me an empathetic impulse. They were saying to me, you are welcome here in China. And I just went about my business as if I were going about my business in Bloomington, Indiana, at Indiana University. But I still reckon with that moment. I still ask myself, why? What was there about that moment in the midst of thousands of people? And yet I felt at ease, at home, comfortable. And so that was, I think, a moment where I was on the side of receiving empathy.
And they were giving you the benefit of the doubt and goodwill and all of that we've spoken of today. Oh, what a great story. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Carolyn, thank you so much.
And thank you for inviting me. This has been a pleasure for me. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to you.
Thank you all for watching and listening. Oh my gosh, we'll see you next week at Purposeful.
Bye to all the listeners out there, and thank you for engaging.
Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.